McAuley Talks of the Year 2020, and it's a pretty wonderful presentation by Jules McAuley over Alexander Hamilton and today's national debt. So, well, I'm going to let her do her thing, but thanks for coming.
Okay, so like you said, I'm going to be talking to you guys about Alexander Hamilton and today's national debt. And I found this quote while I was researching and it seemed fitting to me. It says, men give me credit for some genius. All the genius I have lies in this. When I have a subject in hand, I study it profoundly. Day and night it is before me. My mind becomes pervaded with it. And then the effort that I have made is what people are pleased to call the fruit of genius. It is the fruit of labor and thought. So I was posed the question, how would Alexander Hamilton feel about today's debt ceiling and the government's role in the economy relative to the debt ceiling? And the reason why this quote right here seemed like it was so fitting to me was because initially when I was given this question, I really didn't have a solid answer. I had an idea and I had an opinion on what I thought Hamilton might think, but I really didn't know enough to feel like I had an adequate answer to the question. So what I did was basically study it profoundly until I felt like I had one. I knew that I had to start at the beginning of the story all the way to the end and understand it all the way through thoroughly before I could really give an adequate answer to such a complex question. So basically what I'm going to do today is show you guys kind of the process that I took in order to be able to understand and answer it. Some of the leading questions I asked throughout my research were first, how did Hamilton handle the economy while he was in office? And the way that I kind of looked at this was his writings and historical decisions to look back on. And then, of course, the current state of the American economy overall. So like I said, I needed to start at the beginning, and the beginning of this story is going to be the end of the Revolutionary War. That brings about two main problems that we have to focus on for this particular topic, and not really in an order of importance, but one, you had to pay back war debt, and two, you had to build the nation's economy from the ground up. Hamilton was elected to be, or appointed to be treasurer by George Washington in 1789, and as we know, America's a new nation, so he was the first. And being the first, he had a lot of discretion about what the Treasury was going to be responsible for, and to this day, it's still responsible for what Hamilton put in charge of, the promotion of economic development and public revenue. So going into his career, Hamilton's two main goals were economic success and political independence. And Hamilton wasn't the only one concerned with political independence. America was very much concerned with this at the time as well, being a new nation coming out of the Revolutionary War. This was a main goal for the people, too. So, the first thing that I looked at throughout my research was manufacturing. Hamilton highly supported manufacturing because he believed that it would bring in a substantial amount of revenue, and with that, it would bring economic success and stability. That second part is really important when looking at manufacturing today. It was actually seen to slow after trade tensions with China increased, so that suggests that we are more dependent on on foreign trade than domestic business. Hamilton would have been really disappointed by this. He would have wanted us to be independent politically and economically, and in order to be able to do that, really shouldn't be more dependent on foreign trade than domestic business. But that being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that overall he would have been unhappy with what we were doing here. Just means that specifically he wouldn't be happy with. So the next thing we have to look at is his creation of a national bank. And this was one way that he was able to contribute to the local business, or to political independence and business in 1791, I think it was? 89. No, 91. Okay, so along with the national bank came banknotes, and this was served as a form of unified currency, and it was distributed from the federal government by the largest bank in the nation. And at the time, it had a capitalization of about $10 million, so its economic impact was huge. And the bank was semi-public, meaning that one, it acted as the government's fiscal agent, and two, it could also be used commercially by citizens to be able to pull out loans or, what banks do. So domestically, the advantages were, of course, the more loans that they pulled out, the more money being circulated throughout the economy. Business was booming, basically. Internationally, it brought in a lot of interest. In fact, a lot of the initial investors for the bank were foreign. And like I said, American people were really, really concerned with political independence at the time. So this was not something that made them happy. But Hamilton knew that it was a first step in order to get the economy started and to get the bank to be as successful as it was. So even though it seemed like a step away from political independence, it was really a step towards it. So the next thing you have to look at is credit. And with the Revolutionary War coming to an end and more debt being accumulated than being paid off, our credit abroad for America was really, really low before Hamilton's creation of a national bank and his release of the report on public credit. He actually estimated it to be at around $54 million. And his solution as to kind of how to start dealing with this problem was he proposed that the federal government should assume all the states' debt collectively. And not only that, he would do it by buying it back at full market value. This, of course, stirred up a lot of opposition for a couple of reasons. One, some states had already paid off their war debt. Two, some states already initially had significantly less war debt than other states. And three, and what I thought was the most troubling, personally, the debt was originally sold at a large discount. And like I said, he wanted to buy it back for full market value. Of course, the states weren't happy with this because it meant that they would be paying more than what they originally would have. But you have to look at it as how Hamilton was. He was trying to increase American credit abroad. And ultimately, this was actually implemented into the U.S. financial system, and it worked. It also increased federal power because now the federal government controlled the open market rather than the states. This brought a lot of interest internationally, more than just to a national bank, but an actual growing American economy now. And of course, the federal government welcomed this because, again, they wanted to increase that credit rating. According to a U.S. Treasury report, the first quarters of 1804 considerably exceeds that of the corresponding quarters of the year 1803 in revenue. That is the year that Hamilton died. So ultimately, we can say when he died, he was probably pretty happy with his success. It also indicated a surplus of more than $200,000 in the year 1805. So they also weren't in debt. So when he died, he was probably pretty happy with his career and what he'd done. But really, where does that leave us with how he looks at us now? Hamilton said that the creation of debt should be incorporated the means of extinguishment. And now that we're really going to get into talking about what debt is, I'll let you know. Debt is actually what the federal government owes either itself or its investors. So this is what we were at as of October 1st, 2019 when I wrote my paper. By the end of 2019, we were at about $22.8 trillion estimated. So what Hamilton meant by this quote there at the beginning, the creation of debt should be incorporated in the means of extinguishment, is as the debt is increasing, our federal revenue should be increasing too. That's what I took it to mean. And at least we should be making some effort to be paying some of it back. But it's pretty hard, looking at this number right here, to assume that Hamilton would be very happy with what we've done initially. But as I like to keep reminding you, we have more to take into consideration. Like I said, we have to look at this how Hamilton would. So he valued long-term economic growth over current economic status. So of course, the amount of debt initially is something that needs to be taken into consideration, but you also need to look at these other things here. I've already explained why manufacturing, he wouldn't be too supportive of the way that we're doing it now. So what does that mean for credit rating? Well, as of 2014, Fitch and DBRS both found that the U.S. had a AAA credit rating with a stable outlook. But as of July 31st, 2020, Fitch actually revised that stable outlook to a to a negative one. So we can assume from this that Hamilton would not be too happy or wouldn't be too unhappy with our credit rating, but the outlook he definitely would be very concerned with. That was something that was really important to him was, again, long-term economic growth over current economic status. So he was really more concerned with what it was going to look like in the future. But I'll get more into that a little bit later, how that plays into his opinion of it overall. The next thing we have to look at is the cost of modern-day social programs. These programs are going to include Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And what you're looking at up here is what the Social Security Administration said that each of these programs brought in 2017. So Social Security brought in $2.9 trillion, and then Medicare and Medicaid combined brought in about 1.3, and that brings you to an estimated total of 4.2. And this is actually going to be considered revenue for the federal government because it came from taxpayer dollars. And Hamilton would of course see this as a big plus. That's a lot of revenue to be brought in by these programs. And it's kind of similar to what I said earlier about the National Bank, it being semi-public. It works in a kind of similar manner that the federal government utilizes it as well as the citizens. So Hamilton also said a national debt, if not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. Now, if not excessive is pretty subjective. What I took this to mean is that as long as if the debt is increasing, the revenue should be increasing along with it. And again, we should be making some kind of effort to be paying back to it, but the first part is really what's more important here. So the federal revenue of 2017 was that of $3.3 trillion, according to the Congressional Budget Office, and then they expected the federal revenue for 2020 to be 3.6. So our revenue is increasing along with our debt, as we know, and that would be seen as a good thing. I don't know if it really makes our debt seem considered not excessive, but Hamilton would see that as a step in the right direction. So let's get into answering the question that we really asked here at the beginning. How would Alexander Hamilton feel about today's debt and the government's role in the economy relative to the debt ceiling? Made a little chart here for some of the things that I've gone over. He would be satisfied with the U.S. credit rating, because it was at a AAA. He would be satisfied with the amount of revenue that social programs brought in, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, that $4.2 trillion that they brought in, and then the current state of the U.S. economy. He would be dissatisfied with manufacturing because we are more dependent on China and trade with them, and the sheer amount of debt accumulated, because that 22.8 is a ridiculous number, as most of us would think. And then, well, perhaps most importantly, the outlook for the U.S. economy. Hamilton, again, like I showed you guys, was a lot more concerned with this than what the current state was, and with the Congressional Budget Office saying that the national debt is going to grow to equal about 95% of the GDP by 2029, we can assume that he would probably be more disappointed than he would pleased with our outlook for our economy, along with Fitch changing that economic outlook from stable to negative. Sorry to leave this on kind of a negative note, but the truth does hurt. Hamilton probably would not be happy with the state that we left our national debt and our prospective economy in right now.